Deneb, you're muted. I don't think we can hear you at all.
I'm sorry. Do I need to start from the beginning, or did you hear part of what I was saying?
All the way from the beginning.
I'm sorry?
Please start from the beginning once more.
Okay, my apologies. I thought I had unmuted my microphone. So welcome everyone to the session on SCAR's scientific research programs. My name is Deneb Karentz. I'm a professor at the University of San Francisco, and I'm also the US delegate to SCAR. I'm in California. It's 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So good afternoon or good evening or good morning, depending upon where you are. And thank you so much for joining us. I'm sorry that we're not able to meet in person in Hobart, but I think that this online format has the great advantage of providing the opportunity for many more people to join in and participate in SCAR 2020. This session is going to showcase SCAR's scientific programs. The SRPs are at the forefront of Antarctic research and address the most pressing questions about Antarctica and the Southern Ocean. I think it's important to mention that SCAR does not fund research activities, but is instrumental in facilitating international research collaborations. And we see this done extremely well in the SRP format. The SRP themes represent a true bottom-up approach to identifying key issues and implementing coordinated international efforts to address those issues. The ideas and proposals for SRPs come from the international science community. I should also add that the SRPs are not open-ended initiatives, and they tend to last about 6 to 8 years before being replaced by new SRPs. If you attended the session earlier this week on SCAR's future scientific research programs, or if you watched the recorded session, you'll get a glimpse of what's coming up for the future. Today's session is a repeat from Monday. Most of the presentations are still going to be live today. 2 of them are recorded, but there are people here from all of the SRPs to answer questions in person. If you use the live Q&A link at the upper right of your screen, you can ask questions during the presentations. If there's a question that you really like and would like to hear the answer to, you can actually vote for that question. And questions with the most votes will move to the top of the question queue. The way the session will run is that after each presentation, there'll be time for 1, possibly 2 questions. And then the remaining questions will be saved after the last presentation is made. And we have an open-ended question and answer session at that time. So we're going to start off. The first presentation is going to be on the state of the Antarctic ecosystem, AntEco. The presentation is going to be made by Hugh Griffith, who is the co-chief officer for that SRP. Hugh is a marine biogeographer at the British Antarctic Survey. And so Hugh, I turn the camera over to you.
Sorry, trying to unmute myself at the same time as start a presentation. Welcome everybody, and good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever it is, wherever you are in the world. And sorry we can't meet you in person, but I'm here to talk about AntEco, the state of the Antarctic ecosystem, which is a very broad-ranging SRP that covers everything from genes to ecosystems, from microbes through to blue whales. It kind of covers everything within the biological realm of Antarctica and the Southern Ocean in terms of large ecological processes. And to answer this, we have 3 large, broad-ranging research questions. Firstly, how has Antarctic biodiversity evolved in response to past environmental change? And what does this tell us about its capacity to respond to future changes? So how does the history of Antarctica inform the future? What are the systematics and environmental geographic features of Antarctic biodiversity? So what are these big drivers, and what are the mechanisms that underpin the current distribution of abundance and biodiversity? So why are we where we are today? And given the evolved geographic distribution of diversity and the forecast threats to that diversity, what conservation actions are required for the preservation of biodiversity and mitigation of and adaptation to change. So that's largely human-induced changes, and what can we do to reduce the impact of those changes? To answer those three questions, we had to divide ourselves up into 5 research sectors, all of which interact but have very specific tasks. So we have spatial ecology, where things live, where things don't live, and why you find them in some places and not in others. Molecular ecology and evolution. So this is the study of the genes of organisms and what they can tell us about the history of those organisms, what they're most closely related to, where they come from geographically, and how they fit into the fossil record as well. And that's why we have ecoinformatics and systems biology, which deals with huge amounts of data that are generated by molecular and microbial and other systems to analyze biodiversity, and paleoecology. So as we kept saying in the 3 big research sectors, 3 big questions, what we learn about the past can teach us a lot about what's going to happen in the future. A lot of the scenarios affecting Antarctica today might mirror things that have happened previously in the region, when Antarctica was very different biologically and ecologically. And finally, the kind of human impact side of it. So impacts, trends, and conservation. What we're doing to Antarctica and what we can do to prevent damage in Antarctica. And all of this requires people, and the wonderful people you can see on the screen are our steering committee, and that involves our past chair Don Cowan, who was replaced by Alex Rhodes in 2014, and then Alex moved on to other commitments within SCAR, so he handed the baton to Jan Struggle and myself, and this presentation is on behalf of both Jan and me, and we have been ably supported by Pete Convey and Don Cowan as our deputies. But also all these other amazing scientists cover 6 continents of the world, and their areas of expertise are amazing, and they have been a real support to us. And of course, Julian Gutt, who's down in the corner, who will be presenting the Antira program, enables us to have a crossover with our sister biological program. But we'd be nothing without the 325 members of the mailing list and the many, many other scientists who've taken part in outreach activities and conferences and things like that. So what we produce is science. Now, this science is not funded by the SRP, but we help to bring it together and facilitate it. And that includes huge topics such as climate change on land, in the oceans, and even within a moss bank affecting microbial populations. So everything from the very, very small right up to the very, very big. Other important emerging topics such as plastic pollution. Work within Antico has found that there are certain areas in the Antarctic Peninsula that have as much microplastic pollution as you expect to find on the coast of the United States of America, which is truly shocking. We also look at what drives the diversity, both on land and in the oceans. And that includes food supply, glacial refugia, the effects of sea ice, or on the land where we have effects of volcanic refugia, where we have geothermal energy keeping areas ice-free for long periods of time, right through to the very tiny organisms where we have the very complex and really understudied microbial diversity, which is something that was long overlooked within Antarctic research. And also linking up, as I'll show later on, with many other parts of SCAR and other organizations to look at cross-disciplinary research. So ecology on its own doesn't give you all the answers. You need to bring in the physical sciences and other parts of biology to answer some of the really big questions. And then there are things that are really interesting and exciting results coming out of this science, such as blue carbon, or in this case, benthic carbon. So when that blue carbon reaches the seafloor and is locked away, so taking carbon out of the atmosphere and storing it in the skeletons of the organisms that live on the seafloor. And the theory goes that when they die, that carbon is then essentially taken out of the global system. But that, coupled with things like ocean acidification, where it may become more difficult in Antarctica, despite increases amounts of animals when the sea ice retreats, the ocean acidification may make it harder to lock that carbon in. Then we have huge international endeavors to do predator tracking, for example, where global experts came together to create the biggest database of where really important geographic areas are for the top predators within the Southern Ocean. And even down to, I've talked about the physical sciences informing our biology, but also the molecular clocks that look at the rates of mutation within organisms and the changes to their genes can also give you an idea of how long ago different groups of the same species or related species were connected. And that can tell you when there were things like seaways in Antarctica that would imply that ice sheet collapse must have happened for that to occur. Now, one thing that we don't normally do within SRP is field work, but we were lucky enough within Antico, and it was a real personal highlight for me to be able to undertake some field work in the South Orkney Islands in Antarctica. And I was leading that expedition, and the British Antarctic Survey kindly hosted that. But we had 22 participants from 9 countries and 16 different institutes, 1/3 of which were early career researchers, and over 50% of which were women. And we looked into a marine protected area as part of that monitoring for that marine protected area under CAMLAR. And we looked at the seafloor and the biodiversity, and we did 158 gear deployments, took over 700 photographs of the seafloor, and actually collected over 38,000 specimens, all of which have gone to feed into PhD projects and other related work, and into museums as brand new species that were discovered. So the project really has impact. Even when we were on the expedition, our hashtag of SoAntico reached over 1 million Twitter users. And Antico Science is directly feeding into things like Blue Planet 2, the BBC's 7 Worlds, 1 Planet program, and the forthcoming Frozen Planet 2. And also, Antico is heavily involved in the really well publicized SCAR achievement of the Monaco assessment. And it has made multiple submissions to the Antarctic Environments Portal, which feeds directly into the Antarctic Treaty System. And we're really proud to say that we've come face to face with over 50,000 members of the general public over the last 7 years in various outreach activities. Now, the big part of Antico was bringing people together, as we said. So the majority of funding was spent on this, bringing people together. Over 90 researchers were funded to attend international conferences and workshops. Over half of those were early career researchers and those from developing Antarctic nations. We were involved with 26 conference sessions, and we co-hosted or contributed to 20 different workshops, all of which are producing results to this day. And the collaborations went on not just within our group, but we collaborated with many SCAR organizations and SCAR expert groups, action groups, and SRPs, but also sister things to SCAR, such as MESO and APEX and SUS. But also really importantly, because it was about the people, we also are heavily involved with minorities in polar research, women in polar science, and pride in polar research. And this science was turned into policy. So we fed directly into marine protected areas for the for CAMLAR. We looked at things that were submitted to the Antarctic Treaty, and we also started to change real policy within that. Things like the microplastic work was the first time this had been considered for the Antarctic region. And other huge efforts included the Biogeographic Atlas of the Southern Ocean. And it's been a real pleasure to see the science moving on, because this work means nothing if it doesn't go on to inform real change. And I think that's where I'd like to wrap things up and just thank everyone who has contributed to Antico over the past 8 years. It really has been a huge effort by everyone involved, and we really hope that our legacy will not only be an increased understanding of the ecology of Antarctica, but a real continuation of the many exciting collaborations that started during this project, and hopefully we'll go on long into the future. And we can't really end this talk without mentioning Guido de Prisco. So Guido unfortunately died last year, but I think we all have really fond memories of him as somebody who was a real mentor to a lot of early career researchers. And both Jan and I have had amazing conversations with Guido over the years. He's someone who'll be really missed from the Antarctic community. And with that, I'd like to say thank you very much and hand over for questions.
Thank you, Hugh, for that, that great overview. We do have several questions that were submitted. So we'll take some time and answer as many as we can, and then the rest of those we will get to at the end of the session. So the first one, this is a pretty broad question. What are the main trends you see in Antico?
Actually, there were a lot of trends, as you can imagine with that much science, but we did observe things that happened similarly in the terrestrial and marine, for example, where plants seem to be doing better as ice retreats, whether it's sea ice, reducing the algae in the ocean in terms of both microalgae growing where ice shelves have collapsed, and sort of macroalgae growing where there was sea ice covering it too thickly before. And it's been predicted on land, and we've seen on land changes in the coverage of plant material on the rocks as well. So that was a really important thing, that climate change is visibly changing where these organisms can grow. And I think once you get the plants changing, then the animals follow suit. So it's been a really interesting broad change that actually there are some trends we can see across the whole thing.
Great, thank you. And we actually have time for another question. For Antico, you mentioned conservation as a main topic. What can we do in this area?
I think one of the most important debates going on at the moment is the effectiveness of protected areas, whether they're on land or in the oceans in Antarctica. And I think a lot of the initial decisions, especially in terrestrial environments, but also in the marine realm, now we're getting some marine protected areas, were originally based on some science, but we're getting a better handle on what sort of science needs to be done to not only designate protected regions, but also to monitor them and see if those plans need to be changed. Because in a changing world, you can't just stick with one form of protection and hope that that's going to work in 20 years' time. So the idea that we as a community need to understand that change, so both predict it and monitor it, and then adapt our plans to fit that, is a really important one.
Great, thank you. And time for just one more short question, if this has a brief answer. Where can I find the database on predator tracking?
I would have to put you, there's a paper that's just recently come out, and it includes a whole bunch of authors, including Marianne Lee, I think, and Jan, who's the head of life sciences. So if you chase some of those, or actually just Google Antarctic predators tracking database, you'll probably find that paper.
Great, thank you so much. So we're going to continue on with the next presentation on the Antarctic thresholds and ecosystems resilience and adaptation, which we all usually refer to as ANTERA. Julian Gut is the chief officer for this SRP, and he'll be making the presentation. Julian is a senior scientist at the Alfred Wegener Institute, Helmholtz Center for Polar and Marine Research, and he's also a professor at Oldenburg University. So Julian, I'll pass it to you.
Can you see me?
Yes, all good.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everybody. ANTERA facilitated research on mainly, but not exclusively, climate change related ecological processes in the Southern Ocean and on the continent. Oh, wait, I have to start my presentation. I just said good morning, but here it is already the middle of the night almost. So now, Antira facilitated research on biological processes in the Southern Ocean and on the continent. I think it was Andy Clark who developed during the first preparatory workshop of new biology programs in 2011 the question, how close to the cliff are we? Describing in a popular way.
We don't see your presentation.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I did a mistake. That was my mistake. Oof. Where is, no. No?
Yes, but it's in presenter. Yes, now we're fine. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry again. So it was Andy Clark who developed this question in a very popular way and referring, of course, to the response of organisms and ecosystems to climate change. Some biologists didn't like this question because the language is too popular. However, in a general talk during the Open Science Conference in Portland in 2012, I mentioned this question, and after the talk, a geophysicist approached me and did a small compliment. Julian, this was the first time that I understood what biologists really want to do. So it obviously had a positive effect. I will come back to this question later during this presentation. I will continue now with some facts about our funding and events. And since science was and still is the core of Antira, I will talk briefly about our scientific synthesis. And at the end, I will provide my impressions on the lessons we learned. In our total 8-year budget, the blue proportions in this pie chart indicate the funds which went directly or indirectly to early career scientists. I would like to highlight here our spring course in Buenos Aires in 2018, in which 46 students from 9 countries participated, mainly from South America, but also from Malaysia, Ukraine, and India. This spring course was a great experience for both the students and the lecturers, primarily due to the excellent ambition of the students. We were also quite happy with the hospitality of the host, and the lecturers did their best. Concerning our budget, it was my personal approach not only to support visits of already existing meetings like the SCAR Open Science Conferences, but to create opportunities for new and unique discussions and concepts like our spring course, for example. But there were more of such unique events to which more than 60% of our funds went. Here also in blue in the lower part, such as a post-expedition meeting in Dijon, France, an interdisciplinary and cross-program brainstorming exercise in Barcelona, and a final synthesis workshop in Coimbra, Portugal last year. In addition, we organized larger side events, for example, during the biology symposium in Belgium to discuss the future of SCAR biology, and during the Open Science Conference in Davos on Arctic-Antarctic comparisons, but these side events did not demand specific Antira funds. In this map, you see only the SCAR countries, and in dark blue, the countries where the recipients of our funds came from. I'm quite happy with this coverage, and I'm also quite happy with this gender ratio. But we have to consider that both the geographic coverage and the gender ratio not only indicate our personal selection, they also reflect from which country and from which individual scientists, male or female, we received the most applications. In our scientific synthesis, we identified 10 main messages from the work of the past 10 years, focusing on biological processes in the Antarctic. I will go through these now very briefly. Number one, changes in biogeochemical cycles can develop in different directions. Secondly, there are losers, but also a few species likely to benefit from ocean acidification. Number three, responses to climate change in climate change hotspots are not simple, they are very complex, non-linear and variable. Four, the benthos is more dynamic than previously thought. Five, in terms of climate-induced range shifts, similarities exist between marine and terrestrial systems. Six, protein production and protein damage play important roles in physiological adaptation. Seven, many details have been elaborated on sea ice as a driver for a broad variety of species. Eight, the response of organisms to pollutants, particularly new pollutants such as microplastics, is largely understudied. 9, species on land are endangered due to less isolation after the melting of ice and consequently increasing competition. Finally, specific ecological conditions shape newly discovered habitats such as seamounts, seeps, coral aggregations, and under ice communities. You probably remember this question, and here are my personal and popular answers based on the scientific results. The response to climate change is not a vertical cliff. It is a kind of slalom ski slope. At the peninsula, we are already at the upper part of this ski slope, going mainly down, sometimes a little bit up, to the left, to the right. Maybe we do some small loopings and jumps. Sometimes we are faster, sometimes slower. We cannot look around the next corner or around the next curve, and we do not see the finish line at all. In most other regions in the East Antarctic, we still stand maybe at the starting point. At least we know from physical sciences, especially from the sea ice development, and from the knowledge on the low plasticity of high latitude organisms, that the starting point of this slope is close to us if we are not already underway. But we do not know how steep this slope is, and we do not see the finishing line at all here as well. On my personal experience, I think our integrative approach and to represent a scientifically diverse community was the basis for our success, and it was not always easy, but finally it was a pleasure for me to share this program. An integrative approach meant that we did not split up into male and female or poor and rich, emerging and traditional programs, East and West, young and old, and not into terrestrial and marine themes. Comparing marine and terrestrial themes does not always make sense, for example, to compare biodiversities or ecosystem services on land with those in the ocean. As a consequence, nature conservation strategies demand totally different justifications and approaches. However, a comparative approach makes sense if we discuss something like range shifts, or when we look at adaptation mechanisms, or increasing or decreasing primary production due to climate change. At the peninsula, we have, for example, the Antarctic greening on land, and at least regionally in the ocean, an increase in phytoplankton production. We also came to the conclusion that we still need the fundamental research to support applied aspects. For example, we must understand the adaptation of species and the resilience of communities to predict the future of Antarctic ecosystems. The basis for our success was always the ambition of colleagues who contributed to our output. However, this volunteer work is only possible when it is also supported by science managers, by institute directors and the national delegates. Of course, also SCAR itself, especially the office in Cambridge, was essentially important for our success. Finally, a personal wish and a comment. I think that SCAR should not leave climate-related biological research, particularly when related to changes in the ice, in the water chemistry, and in variables of physical oceanography, so to speak, to SCAR satellites. Some of these formed in the past years quite impressive communities. I belong to some of these. They are powerful, but they exist, so to speak, only at the periphery of SCAR. And I think SCAR's periphery is not the best place to facilitate such important climate-related scientific themes of the Antarctic. Independently of all strategies, the work under the SCAR umbrella was and is always successful when people, independently of gender, of ethnic affiliation, or stage of career, respect each other. In this context, not by chance, one name comes into my mind who is representative for many other colleagues, and it is Guido di Prisco. You mentioned him already. He was such an ambitious Antarctic scientist and played an important role in developing Antira 8 years ago. We had 2 workshops in Italy to prepare these new programs organized by Guido. Due to his fair and open-minded character and his respect, he became a good friend, not only of mine. He left us last year after he still participated in our synthesis workshop, but we will never forget him.
Thank you very much, Julian, for that great overview on the program. We do have time for some questions. So one of the questions that came up, who are the winners of climate change?
For example, the penguins which prefer the open water, in contrast to those who prefer the ice. That are quite prominent examples. Who else? It depends, it is complex, it depends. Maybe we could mention the salps who invade in areas which become warmer and replace the krill. So looking at some regions, the salps are the winners and krill are the losers. In some smaller regions, krill are the winners closer to the continent, further to the south. Krill is the winner, but this doesn't compensate, obviously, the losses in the areas where salps replace the krill.
Great, thank you. And I think we have time for just one more question, at least for a minute. For Antara, what were the biggest surprises in your program?
I think the complexity of responses to climate change. It is a bit simple to say now, referring to the last question, there are not only losers, there are winners. And all that refers to some key species or specific species, but also the processes, the geochemical cycles, the primary production, the energy transfer from one trophic level to the other. All these processes are not linear. They are hardly predictable because in one area they increase, in the other they decrease. That's what I wanted to explain a little bit with this example of a ski slope where it is going to the left and to the right and up and down and fast and slow. So that are all these responses, and not everyone and all processes are suffering.
Great, thank you so much. We're going to move on to the next presentation, which is on the scientific research program, Astronomy and Astrophysics from Antarctica. The presenter is Tony Travaglione, who is the chief officer. And Tony is an instrumentation specialist in the Research School of Astronomy and Astrophysics at Australian National University. Tony, I turn this over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm looking at the right window to share, and we can start right away. Okay, thank you very much, Ned. So I'm representing the expert group on astronomy, and you can see on my slides the different members of our steering committee. We're trying to represent a wide array of specialty within astronomy, but also the other sciences such as atmospheric physics, as well as different age and gender groups. And thank you to all the contributors who gave me all the material I'm about to present. Because we are a bit different from most of the group in the sense that we are looking up, and we have a different footprint on the island. We are mostly occupying the continental bases, and so I wanted to show you basically the different experiments we have running on the continent. So over the last decade, astronomy has seen a bit of a revolution in how we define what we do. Previously, astronomers would basically organize themselves by wavelength, and excuse me, you see there's some waves in front of me here. So we organize ourselves by wavelength, so there would be radio astronomers and infrared astronomers. But lately there's been a change because we've had access to different messengers. There is the addition of experiments on the ice that instead of measuring the arrivals of photons, measure high energy particles such as muons and neutrinos. And even more recently, with the advent of the LIGO experiment, we're also characterizing the skies thanks to measurements of gravitational waves. So there's been really a multiplication by 3 of the data that we've been seeing coming our way, and Antarctica has played a big role in one of them. Part of our group, we also include all the phenomena involving the near Earth, magnetosphere measurements, space weather, and more recently there's been some interest in space traffic and communications, because again we have one thing in common, which is the hardware we use to look up basically. So we are a slightly smaller group than most, I would say, but we have about 200 people on our mailing list. And every half year we meet, so you can actually see the picture at the bottom of one of our workshops, which took place last year in northern Italy, so some place which was pretty familiar to us because it was on a high mountain and there was a lot of ice, so it was very, very nice. One thing I will say as well is that we have a very international group of collaborations because most of the experiments I'm going to show are pretty expensive and require a lot of funds coming from different countries, and so we are heavily naturally oriented towards collaborations between different working group within astronomy and outside of astronomy. Okay, so I'm going to now go through a bunch of different sites that we have experiment on. So starting with the South Pole. So at the South Pole is one of the largest astronomy experiments in the world with the IceCube neutrino observatory. IceCube is a cubic kilometer worth of sensors. So you can actually see on the right-hand side the picture of the South Pole. So it's a square kilometer in area, and the scientists lower strings which have those sensors that you can see on the right that are basically capturing neutrino events. And so by covering such large volume, we can actually measure the path of those high energy particles and determine the characteristic. So it is a bit like a 3-dimensional telescope measuring high level particles. So this is really an absolutely massive experiment which involves hundreds of scientists. And now it's basically entering its second decade. So there's been a lot of measurements done, a lot of data with different types of physics. So we are looking at events coming from astronomical events, like, for example, large explosions in the universe. We're looking at cosmic ray, which tell us about a lot of the history of our universe, as well as atmospheric muons, which are a lot more common. So we can actually see the kind of track that these events do on the array, and you can actually detail a lot more about the type of data you're measuring. So there's a lot of results. I'm just going to highlight this slide to show you the different references and papers, essentially adding information to physics, the nature of neutrinos, for example, and their interaction with matter. We are also using it to alert telescopes to basically follow up on events that have been picked up by this detection, and basically discover new phenomena around the universe, such as, for example, supernovas and mergers and very cataclysmic events. That array will go through an upgrade process, which will basically change or rather improve the spectrum of the muons and the neutrinos that we can measure. So there is already an upgrade path over the next few years to essentially add devices in the ice, and then later increase the size of the array to cover 500 square kilometers. So this one is in the planning stage, and then that gives us access to neutrinos of even higher energy, going from the tera electron volt and beyond. Moving to Dome C. So now we're going a bit higher. Now we are moving to the sites that are 3,000 meters in elevation and higher. And we'll start with some sample of experiments that are led by Italy. There is quite a few happening at Dome C. There is, for example, one of the Super Dawn radar. So the Super Dawn consortium has radars all over the world, and Dome C is one of the sites which increases the baseline that they can use to make the measurements. There is ASTEP, which is a coronagraph which studies the sun and the solar limb. We have a more like a multi-purpose infrared telescope called ITM, which has been now decommissioned for upgrade over the last summer. And there is the upcoming COSMO, which is a monopole observer which looks at the cosmic microwave background radiations, so the early universe. So again, these are some of the characteristics and details about what kind of science that these three experiments are working towards. And I think the breadth of what you see here shows that there is a lot of different types of astronomy that we actually can do from these high sciences, because you have access to a clear sky. You can actually see quite deep in the infrared and in the sub-millimeter, and so the site is very attractive for these kind of experiments. In particular, I want to highlight cosmology and the cosmic microwave background radiation, because there is some experiments at the South Pole, some experiments at the Dome C that look at essentially the earliest part of the universe, what we call the recombination time, where essentially matter as we know it has been formed. And so this is the best location on Earth to actually make measurements of this cosmic microwave background photons and study the earliest part of the universe. Still at Dome C, but now led by France, it's a very, very different type of science here. We're looking at exoplanets. So exoplanet is what we call planets orbiting around other stars. And so there is a different ways of measuring and learning about those planets. And the one that you see here with ASTEP is that we track a given star for a very long time. And so this is why Dome C and Antarctica is very good, because the night is very long. So you can really keep up to the star without having to worry about the sun getting in the way. So we're measuring what we call light curve. And so these little dips you see on all of these plots are basically when the planet comes in front of the star, and by looking at the size of this dip and the amount of time that they take place, we can actually determine a lot of information about those exoplanets here. So there's been quite a lot of publication on that topic, and this is really a field which is likely to grow exponentially, I would say, in the Antarctic. because the only competition is space, basically. And so ASTEP will go through an upgrade, and there's interest to move, for example, from the optical wavelengths to the infrared, so we can follow up cooler stars, where we expect more interesting planets to take place, the ones that are more likely to have life around them. So this is really where the ultimate goal is in that science case, which is to find Earth-like planet. At Domain, I'm moving to the peak of the plateau. That base doesn't quite run in winter yet, but there is regular tracks going there during the summer. And there's been quite a few experiments going. At the beginning, it was mostly about characterizing the site to learn more about the kind of performance we would see. But now we are at the stage where we know enough. We know that what we call the seeing, which is the amount of turbulence in the atmosphere at Domain, is basically the best in the world, and that really gives us a good hope for high-resolution imaging coming from this site. Essentially, very much competing with space, because the atmosphere is really not impactful in how it affects our observations here. Similarly, thank you. Similarly, at Domain, one of the first experiments to go and take some data is AST3, which also measures the exoplanets I was referring to earlier, so I'll just move on. Now I'm going to DOME-F, which is led by Japan. So Japan has been going to Dome Fuji on and off for a few years, at first characterizing the atmosphere as well, and learning a lot about what makes the site great. And in the near future, there is a plan to go to and create a new base called New Dome Fuji, which will be mostly used for core drilling and for astronomy. So you can actually see the timeline on the right-hand side here. And along with this, the experiments, there will be in the early times when there is only a summer base, there will be an automated telescope working in the terahertz, so sub-millimeter wavelength. And then when the base starts to operate and can handle larger experiments, there's a plan for 10-meter class telescope. So there's a long-term prospect for science from Dome A and Dome F in Antarctica, the two highest places, basically. Also on the coast, we have a lot of activities from the people measuring atmospheric events, so the mesosphere for the most part. So this is led by Argentina, for example. This is a project called LAMP, the Latin American lab called NEUROS, for example. It's part of the Heliosphere and Planetary Interaction Network. So they are currently getting early data from this new base at the very tip of the peninsula here. And they're looking at meteorological weather, magnetosphere measurements, cosmic rays detection. And I just want to highlight this slide here because of the broader network that this is part of. So this is really a space weather network that really gets a lot of new data from this part of the world here. Similarly at McMurdo, there is a place for launching space telescopes almost on balloons. So one of the other characteristics of the Antarctic is the vortex, and the vortex can take telescopes around the continent and really give us access to the upper atmosphere and give us conditions very much in competition with what we can get in space. But it allows us to do that with much larger telescopes, a much better resolution. So when you want to, for example, look at star-forming regions, so this is the Vela molecular cloud. On the left, you have a picture from a space telescope called Planck. And on the right, you've got the same field of view observed with BLAST, that larger telescope, which therefore can give you a lot better resolution. So you can actually see all the details of the star-forming region that you can't really see with Planck. So this is a way to not only use the fact that Antarctica has a great atmosphere, but thanks to the current that we're experimenting with, we can actually go even higher and access the near space conditions that we all are looking forward to. And I will stop right there and be ready for question.
Thanks very much, Tony, for that overview. There's two questions, but I'm actually, to stay on time, I'm going to leave those till the end because I think they both relate to other SRPs as well. One of them has to do with how COVID-19 is affecting the collection of data and observations. And the other one is what kind of collaborations does this SRP have with other telescopes around the world? So if you can think about those, we'll come back to them after the presentations are over.
Will
So
do,
right
thank you.
now, thank you. Right now we have a 5-minute break. And so hopefully we'll see you all back here in 5 minutes. Welcome back, everyone. We are going to continue with the presentations of the SCAR scientific research programs. And the next one is Antarctic Climate Change in the 21st Century, AntClim 21. And Tom Bracegirdle, the co-chief officer, has a video which will be the presentation for this SRP. Tom is atmospheric and climate research scientist at the British Antarctic Survey.
Just changing the slideshow. Thank you very much, Taz. So today I will show some key highlights of AntClim 21 and give a flavour of the work that's been done over the last 8 years. But I must say a big thank you to everyone else who's been involved in AntClim 21 over the years. Nancy Bertler, who spent the first 4 years as chief officer, Alia Khan, Gerhard Krinner, Paul Majewski, and Marilyn Raphael, Jolan Russler, and John Turner, all who played a big role in the things I'll show today. And of course, the membership of AntClim 21 as well, who have all contributed in many ways to all our workshops over the years. The overarching question of AntClim 21 is, how will the Antarctic and Southern Ocean climate system change over the 21st century? And we structured the research into this and the collaborations in 3 themes. The first theme was quantification of Antarctic climate variability, and then theme 2 on climate model verification, and theme 3 on Antarctic climate change projections and impacts to the year 2100 and beyond. So focusing first on theme 1, it's very interesting to look back actually, because our first workshop, I think it was maybe the first workshop of AntClim 21 in 2013. And this was specifically on the question of Antarctic climate variability. And I've decided to show a plot here of sea ice extent in the modern satellite era since 1979, because this is a key integrator of the ocean and the atmosphere and the ice system and its variability. And a very intriguing question is why we see a slight increase in sea ice area in the observational record in a warming world. And as part of the output from this workshop, we produced a paper led by Paul Majewski on the potential for Southern Hemisphere climate surprises. And at that time, we were looking ahead and thinking of how the climate system could change in the coming years, and looking back to longer term records and what they could tell us. But of course, we didn't expect this. So after a gradual increase of sea ice extent over a number of years, in the last few years, we've seen a sudden decline in sea ice. So I wouldn't say we predicted it at this workshop, but it was an interesting example of the fact that the recent observational record is probably not quite long enough to give us a good impression of how variable the Antarctic climate system can be and some of the rapid changes we might expect. So linking modern observations with past reconstructions is a key part of AntClim 21, and we've produced lots of excellent science over the years linking these together. We've looked at Antarctic Peninsula warming and then the more recent absence of that warming. We've looked at the Ross Sea dipole, and we've linked together the broader community in a bigger paper, linking together pages and other networks. In terms of climate model verification for the Antarctic region, that has been a really big part of AntClim 21. And of course, if you think about it, what defines a good climate model is a very difficult question. So climate models are complex mathematical representations of the real world. But of course, whether or not is a good climate model really depends on what questions you're asking. For ANCLIM 21, the focus is on future projections and supporting informed decision-making and quantifying uncertainty. So combining observations and models, which are our theory of how the world works, is of fundamental importance to science. And so it really was a key effort in ANCLIM 21. And as part of this, we organized a big workshop, the Great Antarctic Climate Hack, which was led by Joel N. Russell. And it was a fantastic workshop, mainly because through SCAR, we were able to bring together a multidisciplinary community based a perspective on evaluating climate models that would be very difficult to do without SCAR's networks. We brought together oceanography, glaciology, atmospheric research, aquatic biogeochemistry, and biology. We also brought together researchers from more than 17 countries, a proportion of whom were early career scientists. And in current times, it's actually interesting to think that we organized this workshop with a huge effort in online participation, and approximately half the 92 participants joined us online from around the world. And that was an interesting early indication of how that can also help to connect to the wider community. And this is just a representation of all the different groups that came together for that workshop. So another aspect of major success of ANCLIM 21 has been to link into some of the amazing new observations that have been coming through from projects such as the SOCOM project, where many new platforms for observing the ocean have become available and are now able to observe ocean change under the sea ice, for example. And that's helped to give us insights into how the ocean is changing in new areas in recent years. And also the development of an online climate model atlas that was part of a collaboration between SOCOM and ANCLIM 21. And then Antarctic climate change projections and impacts to 2100 and beyond. This aspect has brought together many different linkages. And again, starting with basic climate model research, improved climate projections, and being able to take those into policy, linking to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the Antarctic Climate Change and Environment, ACCE report, which after it was originally produced has also developed into a very important annual update for policymakers and for use within SCAR. We contributed reports to the Antarctic Environments portal as well. And then we've developed a very strong collaboration with the Ice Sheet Model into Comparison project, which is part of the current new development of climate models that's becoming available for the next IPCC report, CMIP 6, and advise them on how to use climate models in their future projections. Antira and Antico, in collaborations with them, these other SCAR SRPs, have produced some of our highest impact science in terms of terrestrial change and also ocean changes. So we've been, over the years, made a big impact scientifically, but also in terms of other aspects of communication, so through Twitter and Facebook, and reaching a much wider audience. And up until recently, we've continued to produce papers that are now still just being published and are being cited in the currently developing IPCC report. And for me, probably a huge thing I will take away from working with ANCLIM 21 is the vibrant international community that we've developed over the years. So this is a photo from last year's 2019 workshop in Cambridge. And the people you see here represent a range of disciplines that have come into the project over a number of years. And like previous speakers, it's such a shame that we can't meet in person this year, but it's great to be able to do this online. Another aspect that's really important to ANCLIM 21
2 minutes remain.
And encouraging early career researchers. We've had early career representation on the ANCLIM 21 steering committee right from the start. Alia Khan was selected through Apex, and she's sat on our committee ever since. She joined as a PhD student and is now an assistant professor. So we've seen her move through different career stages. Certainly we've benefited in terms of, or ANCLIM 21 has benefited massively in terms of better linkages with the early career community. And hopefully there's been a reciprocal benefit, and that Alia has also benefited through her career. We've supported attendance at major science meetings, conferences and workshops, such as last year's workshop in Cambridge as well. So to finish, I mean, one of the feelings in putting this presentation together is partly a sadness that the last 8 years is coming to an end, but also that there should be a determination that the legacy from ANCLIM 21 should continue into the future, and those networks and teams and excellent connections that have been developed over the years can hopefully continue into the future through different strands of activities within SCAR and also more widely. And finally, without the support of SCAR, this really wouldn't have been possible. And it's been great to have the opportunity to develop the science and the excellent opportunities over the years. So thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Tom. So Tom is actually here online, and we have time for one question. There are several here, and I'll ask you one, and then we'll take up the others at the end. But the one question is, how much of the work from ANCLIM 21 is actually going to be going into the new program planning proposal ANCLIM Now?
So that's yeah, a similar question came up last time. Just double checking, can you hear me okay through the microphone? Perfect. One of the key distinctions between ANCLIM Now and ANCLIM 21 is in terms of timescale. And the legacy from ANCLIM 21 and the follow-on work partly divides a little bit. Well, there's a bit of a gap actually in terms of the prediction and projection work or subject matter that was part of ANCLIM 21, and that was the near-term climate prediction and variability aspects. And so not an awful lot actually of what was done in ANCLIM 21 will feed into ANCLIM Now. And that's represented in the quite different personnel that have come into ANCLIM Now, who are much more focused on shorter term variability and near term change. So a lot of the legacy from ANCLIM 21 will probably go more into this instant and the sort of longer term projection side of things. Yeah, that's probably a reasonable summary of how things will go.
Great, thank you so much. And as I said, we'll come back to the other questions after the other two presentations are made. So the next presentation is on solid Earth response and influence on cryospheric evolution, CERC, and this will be presented by Pippa Whitehouse, who's a Joint Chief Officer for this SRP. And Pippa is an associate professor in the Department of Geography at Durham University in the United Kingdom.
Thank you very much, Deneb. So I'm one of two chief officers of CERC, and just bear with me. Just going to check that I can see my screen okay. So this research program is interested in understanding feedbacks between the ice sheet and the solid Earth. I will tell you a little bit more about our interests in the next slide. And then for the central part of the talk, I will talk about some of the highlights that have taken place during the program. And I will also talk about how we've involved you in this program and how our area of interest has actually grown over the last few years. And we're now very integrated with some of the other SCAR programs. So CERC was initially established by Terry Wilson, and she ran the program for the first 4 years. You see her here with her two favorite things, some rocks from Antarctica and a GPS receiver. It was then taken over by Matt King and myself, and we are assisted by a steering committee of 20 people, which includes 6 ECR scientists. We represent 12 countries on that group, and you can see the range of areas that we cover. Now, I haven't listed it here, but it's also interesting to look at the gender split in that group. We're about 1/3 female, 2/3 male on the steering committee. And that was also represented in some of our side meetings in the early years, but it's nice to see actually we're closer to 50-50, and we're definitely 50-50 on the training schools that we run. Just 2 years ago, a subgroup was formed interested in geothermal heat flow, and I will talk more about that in the science highlights. And looking at our mailing list, we have over 200 people on there, representing over 27 countries. And I worked out the list of countries from looking at people's email addresses, but I'm aware that hidden in there's many researchers who will actually be working overseas. And that's one of the things that we see very clearly through SCAR activities, the amount of sort of international mixing that goes on with ideas. The objectives of CERC were to understand interactions between the solid Earth and the cryosphere. And this was to answer 3 big questions: understanding how quickly the ice sheet is changing, the dynamics involved in that change, and how that is changing sea level. Now, it might seem quite a big step to go from understanding the solid Earth to answering those big questions. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. This is a diagram of how I sort of view, a cartoon of how I view the ice sheet deforming the solid Earth. As the ice sheet grows, the Earth underneath is pushed downwards, and as it shrinks, the land rebounds upwards. And we can see this by measurements of GPS instruments around the continent. It turns out that this deformation of the solid Earth is crucial to understand if we want to understand how quickly the ice sheets are changing and how the sea level is changing. In the bottom left here, I show the grey satellites. They're measuring the mass of the ice sheet as it's changing. But because the Earth underneath the ice sheet is moving, these satellites also detect that movement. So it's crucial to understand the pattern of deformation of the Earth to correctly interpret the mass change of the ice sheet. On the right here, I show a model prediction of how sea level will change as West Antarctica is melting. The important thing to take away here is that sea level change is not uniform as an ice sheet melts. And in particular, the pale colours show areas where sea level rise is less than the average amount of melt. So, for example, if there was 1 millimetre per year of melt, there'd be less than that observed in the southern hemisphere. But around the northern hemisphere, we would see greater than the average amount of sea level rise as the ice sheet melts. And our understanding of this pattern comes from understanding the deformation of the solid Earth in response to ice sheet change. These 2 big questions feed into many community activities to understand the cryosphere and the climate. But prior to CERSI, there wasn't really a community home for people studying these interactions between the ice sheets and the solid Earth. But following on from the creation of CERSI, we've made some really exciting leaps forward in this field. I've put the main aim up here again, and I would just like to highlight some of the science highlights of the programme. The main area in which many of our people are involved in is to understand the isostatic deformation of the solid Earth as the ice sheet grows and shrinks. This is what's needed to correct those satellite measurements by GRACE for the mass change. And a classic way to do this would be to use constraints on past ice extent, feed that into a model which then predicts how the land is deforming underneath. There's many, many unknowns in that process. Just last year, we published a paper which documented some of the leading ideas of the pattern of solid Earth deformation underneath Antarctica due to changes in the ice sheet. You can see there's a lot of variability there, so we have some more work to do. What I really want to highlight here is the different ways in which we went about determining these estimates. And in particular, the ones I've highlighted here, coupled modelling and 3D modelling, did not even exist at the start of CERSI. So these are areas which have almost evolved out of discussions that have taken place during the SRP. The one I'd like to pick up on first is about this idea of including 3D Earth structure. On the top right here, I show some measurements of deformation across Antarctica measured by GPS instruments. As we started to look at these measurements and model what we thought the deformation should be in response to the ice sheet change that we understood, these did not match up. And in fact, these measurements are much, much faster than we expected. And this led us to understand that the Earth underneath Antarctica is not like the rest of the world. In fact, in some areas, the mantle is very, very weak and it deforms much more quickly than it does around many of the rest of the continents. So we realized that our models needed to be a little bit different from models that considered global processes to do with response to surface load change. Another strand of CERSI was to use seismic information to try and map out the structure of the mantle. You won't be able to see the outline of Antarctica very well in these images, but you will see a blue area and a red area on these two model predictions. The red area, these areas where the seismic data is imaging this very weak mantle, and the blue area is East Antarctica, where we think the Earth is very strong. So we now have some information about the Earth structure, and we feed that into these models and predict the land deformation. And it turns out it really changes our predictions. Here I've highlighted papers that look at the impact on the GRACE measurements and the impact on sea level fingerprints. These are just two papers of a wide range of papers that have come out in this completely new field over the last 8 years. So we're making a lot of progress, but there's still lots of questions. There's still lots of unknowns and uncertainties to be constrained. I mentioned there were two ways in which we determine that land deformation, which have completely evolved from scratch, essentially, during the course of CERSI. And the second one is to understand the impact of the solid Earth on the dynamics of the ice sheet. Now, when CERSI was reviewed as a proposal, one of the reviewers commented that there was no such feedback. And we're very happy to say that we think we've proved them wrong, and we think that there are feedbacks. The theory was laid out by this paper by Natalia Gomez in 2010. Many of you will be familiar with the marine ice sheet instability, which is a runaway process by which the ice sheet loses mass. Natalia showed that by including deformation of the solid Earth in our model predictions, then the rebound of the Earth can put the brakes on that process and actually help to stabilize the ice sheet a little bit as it starts to lose mass. This idea has been incorporated into models, into the evolution of Antarctic ice sheet. And the big question we're left with at the moment is the strength of that feedback. How easily could we stop ice sheet change due to this rebound process? What's the strength of that feedback? There've been a couple of papers now looking at re-advance of the ice sheet during the Holocene. And the idea here is that actually this rebound process can help to stabilize and maybe even trigger that re-advance. This was on a very, it's important to say that that paper was during the Holocene, not in the current climate forcing, which is sort of well outside normal for glacial interglacial cycles. The last step in our sort of development of ice sheet modeling, sorry, of GIA modeling, is to actually include the first idea I talked about of including that Earth structure into some of these models. So we've really come away. Please do go and have a look at some of these papers to see where the field has gone. The last highlight I'd like to mention is to do with the boundary conditions between the solid Earth and the ice sheet. And I highlight here the idea of the water at the bed and the geothermal heat flow at the bed. Just a couple of years ago, a group of scientists came to Matt and I and asked to hold a small workshop on geothermal heat flow. We provided some funding for that. We then had a side meeting at the ICES meeting in Korea last year. And this year we have published a white paper on Antarctic geothermal heat flow. We've uncovered a whole realm of sort of disagreements in this field and questions that need to be asked. So this is one way that CERSI has helped to almost bring together a whole new group of scientists. Another thing we have funded, just mentioned quickly, was a training school on glacial seismology, again, an area which didn't really exist at the start of CERSI. So it's very exciting to look back at the highlights. But what I'm going to talk about just in the next slide is how we've done this. And of course, CERSI has not funded the science, but we have funded the opportunity to bring scientists together. I'll draw your eye to the column here with the red writing. These are some of the big workshops that we've held where we've brought scientists together to discuss these ideas. Most of our funding has gone to bringing early career researchers and researchers from countries with emerging Antarctic programs to these meetings. But we would like to acknowledge a lot of the funding that we've had from partner groups. I'll just draw your attention to the second last bullet point here about statements on future research directions. In recent workshops, we've held our own mini horizon scan and asked the community to put together questions that they think are pressing in this field. And these are published in the reports on these activities on our news page. The other large area we have funded, highlighted in blue here, are a series of training schools. So we don't just bring the scientists together, but we're training a new generation of scientists. There's a lot on this slide, so please look back and take in some of the details. I'll just highlight this area here. In the GIA training schools over the last 2 schools that we've run, we've had over 30 nationalities represented. We were actually oversubscribed 4 times from what we could accommodate. So we also ran a process where we let people join in virtually, and we recorded all the training schools and they're available online for the next generation. So what is next? As we look back, there've been some really exciting questions answered, but also some new questions have evolved. There's more work to be done thank you. More work to be done to understand the interactions between the ice sheet and the solid Earth. But also, we need to look outside our group. On here, I've included some interactions with the atmosphere and the ocean. And we're now seeing that we're going to have to collaborate with some of the other SRP programs in SCAR to make real progress. That's already started with the development of the Instant program. And we're looking forward to being able to bring some of our conversations about ice sheet solid Earth interactions into a wider community. There's one challenge that remains, and that's to do with data and observations. We're finding now that autonomous measurements are very useful, ones that are running without our need to be there, but there's this quite precarious nature for these measuring systems. So that's something we would like to push forward as we move into Instant. So my final slide, I would just like to thank SCAR for providing us with the opportunity to bring together so many people from so many backgrounds. The ethos of inclusivity that you foster has really created an environment that's enabled us to have a lot of discussion and progress. And by funding that opportunity, then SCAR has facilitated some really impressive advances in our understanding of interactions between the ice sheet and the solid Earth. Thank you.
Thank you, Pippa. That was a very nice overview for us. I think we have time for one quick question, and I'll save the other one for later. Are you finding any areas where the ice sheet is growing?
The $60 million question. We see We see areas where the ice sheet's growing in the interior because there's an increased snowfall in that area. As you warm the atmosphere, the snowfall will increase. What is very difficult to understand is whether that is offsetting the massive losses we're seeing at the edges. I think it's very clear from the continent-wide estimates that there's net loss, but yes, there are some areas which are growing, and it's important to understand why that's happening, what the processes are driving that.
Great, thank you so much. So we're going to move on to the last presentation, and then after that we have an open time for question and answer. So we'll go back to some of the questions that we have not answered yet, and you can still keep putting your questions into that live Q&A box. So the next presentation is on past Antarctic ice sheet dynamics. And the co-chief officer, Laura DeSantis, is going to make the presentation, which is recorded from earlier in the week. But we do have her present online, and she'll be able to answer questions afterwards. Laura is a researcher at the Italian National Institute of Oceanography and Experimental Geophysics in the Department of Geophysics and the Lithosphere.
Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, depends where you are. Let me thank the other co-chief officer, as was done by my previous presenters for each of the programs. I'm sharing this very important responsibility with Team Nish, at least in the last 4 years. And I'm also sharing the leading of this huge geoscience program with Carlotta Scuzia and Rob De Conto, who were the first coordinating the program in the first 4 years between 2013 and 2016. And of course, I ought to acknowledge also the large steering committee, which is made by at least 30 members from 15 countries and involving also several young scientists who brought ideas and sparkling activities into the program. As was already said, the basic philosophy for the past Antarctic ice sheet dynamics is to provide information along transects, data transects from the hinterland of the Antarctic ice sheet to the ice proximal to the more distal and deep ocean, and also including far-field records in a longitudinal and latitudinal way to cover a whole bunch of variety in terms of environmental change around the Antarctic margin. The aim is to provide information, multidisciplinary information about the evolution of the Antarctic ice sheet to ice sheet and ice shelf modeling and glacial isostatic adjusted sea level models. So the main questions we want to achieve is basically what was the contribution of the Antarctic ice sheet in the past to sea level change, which is one of the gaps that was recognized, was identified already in 2013 when PAIS started to work. And we try to do it by trying to constrain the rate and amplitude of past change of the Antarctic ice sheet, and which are the tipping points the Antarctic ice sheet crosses during its during the Cenozoic time frame. So the area the PAIS community has been focusing more is basically in 3 key environments to provide information about basal hydrology, about the evolution of the continental margin, and the interaction between the ocean and the ice sheet back in time. So the overall aim was to reconstruct ice volume, atmospheric and oceanic temperature to identify past polar amplification and assess forcing and feedbacks. A few examples of past subglacial hydrology comes from 2 recent work, one in the Amundsen Sea, the one to the left by Gerard Kuhn, and one from the Ross Sea from Lawrence Sinkins. They provide very nice examples of a paleo subglacial lake and a water channel forming right seaward of grounding zone wedge that are key information that inform the model, the ice sheet volume models about the size and the rates of change during the last glacial maximum and past ice sheet retreat. Many other works have been done around the margin of the Antarctica, but there are still 2 spots. We need much more in the future. Another key, other key works are about understanding the role of pinning points, and pinning points can be constructed as a sedimentary wedge, grounding zone wedge, formed at the base of the ice sheet during the ice sheet retreat, and that's an example from the Ross Sea, which actually acted as a stabilization for the ice sheet during the step back. And the other one is from Kings Lake. People already mentioned this. It's basically ice sheet retreat after the Holocene that re-advance again due to isostatic rebounds that create the condition for bedrock shallowing. But what the ice community has been mainly focusing on is trying to understand the signature of main phases, main episodes that characterize the atmospheric CO2 record and deep sea benthic isotopic records in the Cenozoic. There are significant shifts into these curves that are probably representing thresholds where the Antarctic ice sheet cross tipping points. And so we've been working on seismic unconformities to check in the geophysical data if there is any signature, any information, any evidence of these kind of thresholds, and combining with, of course, a drill site. And if you see at in the bottom line, I labeled some of the unconformities that have been recognized in the Ross Sea, the Wicksland, the Munson Sea, Weather Sea. They're all similar in terms of time span range, and they match with some of these key episodes. So this has been possible only in the frame of a large program like PAIS, which allow us to share data in open source data bank like the Seismic Data Library system that allow to use over than 300,000 kilometers of seismic. They are open and free. And of course, the coordination with the International Ocean Discovery Program and the legacy from Andrei allow to actually optimize the logistical effort and the large investment. So one of the main products of PAIS that comes from this huge effort is the publication of the paleobathymetry of the circumantarctic Southern Ocean that was published recently in 2020 by Katarina Ockmuth, showing how nicely it's possible to actually reconstruct the evolution, the geodynamic evolution, but also the stratigraphic evolution of the Antarctic margin and surrounding continents. This is one of the milestones that will be used by ice sheet models that actually need this information to estimate past ice volume change versus climate. Another interesting product, very important as well, is the one published by Guy Paxman et al. In 2019. And in this case, the Pan-Antarctic topographic evolution is reconstructed back in time up to 34 million years ago. As you see, there are many areas that gradually deepen from terrestrial to shallow water to deep ocean, especially the one in the Western Antarctic ice sheet, but also some sectors of the East Antarctic ice sheet that then create, make the Antarctic ice sheet much more vulnerable through time. This has been demonstrated also by other models like Gasson. Gasson used this paleobathymetry to build a colder and warmer climate in the Miocene and check how large were the fluctuation in a high CO2 world. And that was constrained very nicely by also drill sites like the one published by Francesca Sangiorgi in 2018 and Richard Levy in 2016, about the Andriel and the Wilkesland sites. They found a very high surface temperature warming in the Miocene climatic optimum. And so they raised the point that there was a very strong polar amplification by that time, which is supporting the vulnerability and the high sensitivity of the Antarctic ice sheet in a high CO2 world. This is coupled with other works like the Leviathan 2019 that actually show that the transition from terrestrial to marine-based ice sheet occurred exactly in the Miocene, when the ice sheet actually carved its own bedrock, as demonstrated by Florence Colleoni et al. In 2018. So the vulnerability of the Antarctic ice sheet increased in the early Miocene to the late Miocene, and that made most of the marine-based sector as vulnerable to ocean warming and responding more to obliquity to the ocean warming, especially in the Miocene when sea ice was not so much developed. When the sea ice developed in the late Miocene to Pliocene up to the present time, that worked as more isolation. So it reduced the sensitivity to ocean warming. But in the future, in a warming world where the sea ice will be reduced, the ice sheet is actually very, very vulnerable because it's landward deepening and over deepened, and so it will be particularly sensitive to high CO2 increase. Of course, we need more data to test these results and to understand the complexity of the environment and how the nature works. So more recently, a lot of work has been focused on understanding the role of the ocean, then how the ocean actually trigger past ice sheet retreat. And of course, many work have been dedicated to understand the Amundsen Sea and the Ross Sea sector, because they are supposed to be the most vulnerable, the most sensitive, where there are the largest ice shelf and where actually has been observed ice sheet and ice shelf thinning fast during the last decades. One of the key work was published by Hillenbrand in 2017 and Smith in 2016 in the Amundsen Sea. So they found that there was a huge reinforcing of the subpolar jet during the glaciation that enhanced upwelling on circumpolar deep water in the Amundsen Sea, both in recent time, around 1940, between 1940 and 1945, that are of the ungrounding of the Pine Island Glacier in 1970, so very recently, and but also 7,000 years ago. So what Hillenbrand observed is that there is a nice signature in the geochemical composition of forams, showing coupling very nicely with shift in the northern ice mass incursion in the Amundsen Sea. So that means that upwelling of circumpolar deep water actually forced the retreat of the ice shelf and then of the ice sheet in the Pine Island Glacier. A nice work done recently by Tinto et al. By the Rosetta group in general is to test whether the circumpolar deep water is actually reaching the grounding line in the Ross Sea below the Ross ice shelf. And it seems that at present, at least, the circumpolar deep water is actually entering the continental shelf, following the route along the main glacial valley below the Ross ice shelf, but it doesn't get to the grounding line, which is well 100 kilometers south. And so it's melting the Ross ice shelf, the marginal areas, but at present day, it's not a real dangerous, a real risk for the grounding line itself to retreat. And yes, thank you. At the IODP 374 and coupled with the previous Andre site, will actually investigate such a process back in time sorry, at the edge of the the continental margin. We drilled several sites from the shelf margin, from the deep channel levee on the flank of this canyon. And we found a huge population of foraminifera and also diatom, very thick contoritic deposit on the margin and also on the deep water that will for sure inform about the role of circumpolar deep water in the past by possibly triggering retreat of the ice sheet across this margin. There are a bunch of papers in preparation and some are submitted already, so lots of interesting things will come up soon. Nice work that is already showing a nice link between the Antarctic worm and the ice loss is from the Wixland. Those are data previously collected by the IODP expedition 318 here. And what we see is that there is a correspondence between the provenance, the detrital, and also the productivity at this site during the Pleistocene warmest interval, MIS 11, 7, 9, and 5. And a retreat of the ice sheet has been recorded up to 700 kilometers for MIS 11 along this, the weakest spacing here. And that means that for only 2 degrees centigrade, but lasting for quite a long time, something like 2,500 years, it's enough to trigger such a great retreat of the ice sheet, which is equivalent of 3-4 meters of sea level globally. That's a nice compilation by Andrea Dutton that shows that PAIS is able to actually provide numbers about the contribution of the polar ice sheet to the sea level, but what we don't know yet is what's the singular contribution of Antarctic versus Greenland. So that's something we should investigate in the future. And of course, all models that try to match this estimate, like the one from Rob de Conto and Polar 2017, include the physical processes occurring at the base of the ice, what's actually reducing the stability of the ice, like the marine ice sheet stability and the marine ice cliff instability. So these physical processes that were investigated during the PAIS life were actually included into the new generation of models that allow to provide new estimate for the future sea level change, at least with a not so large uncertainty for the next 100 years, but the uncertainty is quite large if we go further in the future. A nice results from Rob de Conto is that in 2500, actually most of the west marine-based Antarctic ice sheet will be gone, and so the sea level globally will rise of 7 meters, and this is strongly based on past constraint. So those numbers are those that the PAIS community were able to provide. Other examples using the past to constrain the future come from Clark, for example, that modeled the future change based on a long time of observation, starting from the last glacial maximum and going in the future up to 10,000 years. That's to test the sensitivity of the Antarctic ice sheet to respond to low or higher high CO2 atmospheric content, and the time to get back to the equilibrium state again. So the last slide is just to show how huge the program is. As I said, we are many scientists, both in the steering committee, but the mailing list is huge. It's more than 300 names in there, lots of young people involved in school and training courses. We had 2 schools organized by Denise Kulajnek and Trevor Williams in 2016 and 2019. Very successful, enthusiastic people, which would be the next generation. And we all work in Instant in the future, together with people from CERSI and other program. We have a lot of discover, and I can say that, as Pippa said, thanks, Scar, because it's really very important to be part of such community and be able to meet other scientists and learn from them and share data and get ideas to high impact publication that will serve future generation. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Laura. That was a very nice overview for us. And in order to stay on time and have time for the open discussion, I'm actually going to go back to a question that was asked of Tony. And I think that the other groups will also be able to complement his answer to this. But the question related to the COVID-19 situation and whether or not long-term observations at stations and telescopes are going to be affected this year by COVID-19.
So I think for every existing telescope and facility, I think the impact will be minimum, in the sense that because we are operating during the winter, we have to make all our observatory very much autonomous and rely on maintenance from a small crew during the winter. So I think the existing telescopes will be okay and data will flow as normal, but for all the upgrades and new systems, that will be delayed due to the smaller, just to the smaller crew that will access during the summer for installation and you know, less access to the site overall.
Great, thank you. There was actually a session about COVID-19's impacts on Antarctic research. So if those of you in the audience missed that, you can go back and watch the recording of it. But I'd also like to ask the other panelists if they would like to make any comment about this situation in terms of its impact on collecting data. Go ahead, Hugh.
Yeah, it's in the terms of biology, it's going to be very mixed. So there'll be some things that work going on stations where they have permanent staff there anyway, who will be able to carry on with what they're doing and hopefully be replaced after the winter season, for example. But there'll be other things like a lot of expeditions on ships or deep field terrestrial work will definitely be impacted because the numbers of scientists and support staff going in to Antarctica this year will be greatly reduced across all nations. So I think there's some work that can be deferred until next year, but if it's specific for a timestamp, then we're going to miss a lot of things on that.
Thank you. Anyone else have any comments they'd like to make? Pippa, go ahead.
Thank you. There's positives and negatives here. Something that's always struck me in Antarctica is that we're very resourceful in building systems that will continue running even if we can't get to them. So Antarctica is good for solutions in that respect. But something which I think will impact many people is those people who are maybe doing PhDs or postdocs who will lose a field season. And so for those people in those positions, this year is going to be quite damaging. But there's a strong steer from SCAR to think about how we can share the data that we have to still help the careers of those people who will miss out on quite a crucial experience.
Thank you. So there are two questions here that I'm going to combine. First question was actually directed towards AntClimb 21, and it was, how do I get involved in the program? And the second question was directed to all of the groups, and I think it relates to that first one, is how do you support early career researchers? So Tom, if you wanted to take a first crack at how do you get involved in your program, that would be great.
Well, these programs are all winding up now. So, well, AntClimb 21, but look out for the new round of SRPs that are coming up, and I'm sure the person who asked the question may have seen the session on program planning groups and the next round of scientific research programs. So for those, the best way to get involved is to look at the SCAR website. You can see which programs are being developed, and the main contacts there. Essentially, we're always very open for people to join, and the main thing is just to contact the main people involved. In fact, we are planning. So I'm also involved in AntClim now, the next one of the follow-on SRPs, and something we're very keen on doing is to make it very obvious on the website, you know, how to sign up and how to get involved. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Other groups, anybody want to chime in? Hugh?
Yeah, so I don't want to tread on Julian's toes too much, but both Antico and Antira have both got mailing lists that you can sign up to from the website, and I think we intend on at least continuing them on slightly beyond the life of the programs until the next SRPs are established and we can kind of transfer those mailing lists over to the appropriate SRPs. But essentially, those are good ways of finding out what's going on, because we don't have quite as tight a goal as some of the other SRPs where they're working on a single issue almost, that we share information via those mailing lists really well. So I think that's a really good way of getting in and finding out what's going on, and then from there you can choose what you want to be part of.
Great. Julian?
For me, the key word how to support early career scientists is integration, to bring the early career scientists and the experienced seniors or mid-career scientists, to bring them together. I appreciate very much the work of Apex, that they support the early career scientists, how to write a proposal, how to write an application. That is very important for the early career scientists. But if we talk about science itself, it is the best way to bring the young and the older scientists together, that everybody learns from each other. The young people, they bring in the best and newest ideas, and the seniors, okay, they have to select what is a crazy idea, which is not feasible, and what is feasible, and to provide access to expeditions and stations and so on. But to integrate, to bring them together is for me most important.
Yes, anyone else? Laura?
Yes. From the PAIS perspective, I agree with what has been said so far. And what we've done basically is always encourage people to ask funds to attend conferences and courses. And also, when we organized our conference in 2017, we before that we opened a call, ask Apex to help, because we wanted to include some early career scientists in our steering committee, and that was the case. So we welcome at least two of them, Matthew Casado and Pamela Santibanez. So they were helping us to organize the conference itself. They organized a workshop, Apex workshop, during the conference, and since then they were very active. But not just the two of them. We try to stimulate early career scientists to be part of sessions like conveners. And so, for example, during the last SCAR 2018. So that's the way. I mean, we don't have funds for research, but we can stimulate participation and integration of young and senior.
Great, thank you. Anyone else want to make a comment? Yes, I saw someone raise their hand, but there's no name.
Oh, it's Tim Nash, and
Yeah, nice to meet you.
thanks, Deneb. I'm one of the leaders of the new SRPs, like Tom. It's the instant program, which we talked about in another session. I just want to reiterate what everyone said, and also add to Laura's comment. And I just, it comes back to the COVID-19 challenge. I really think that does throw an extra layer of difficulty on how we bring early career researchers and young people along, and also in these new programs, because in the past, as Laura said, we've tried to facilitate, we've given them, funding to come to workshops, and it's going to be so much harder to do, to initially make your contacts, make your networks, and get going. So I think, a real challenge for us with the new SRPs is to figure out a way which we can engage young people, give them roles in the SRP, and get them going really on in the setup stage. Thanks.
Great, thank you. So we don't have much time left, and there's a number of questions here. Some of them are quite specific, and so I think we'll leave those and let them get answered afterwards. But there are two questions, which again, I'm going to combine, which I think will be important to hear about. And the first one is, what advice do you have for the next generation of SRPs? And then I'm going to add to that, there's a question here, what is the added value of being a SCAR program? Anyone want to start on that?
My words of advice would be, keep lots of notes about what you've done over the year, rather than trying to remember them all at the end of the year when you have to report, because we do so much. And it's like when you're writing your end of year report for work or something, where you forget all the brilliant things you did when you're trying to do your paperwork. And actually, that was the thing that really got me, was trying to keep up with the amazing work that people were doing within the program and trying to represent that well, even in things like this talk, when you're trying to represent 7 years worth of people's work. And it's so hard. And so, yeah, you don't really feel like you're doing justice to the amazing things that people are doing. So yeah, that's my main hint, is to kind of keep on top of it as you go along, and don't try to remember it all at the end of the year.
Thank you. Pippa?
So in a nice partner to Hugh's comment there, is also about looking forwards. Something which is very difficult to do is get input from the whole community. And I wonder if there's a way to create a space where people can constantly provide ideas and thoughts on the direction of the SRPs. And having looked at some of the chat in the poster and the text sessions, early career researchers are really engaging with the online process, and you will get input from those if we can find a way to get the ideas into us.
Thank you. Yeah, Tony?
Yes, again, a complementary answer here is that at least in astronomy, we have a lot of external network that we're also part of, and capturing the Venn diagram, all these overlaps, all the collaborations, and when they come in, and capturing the data to help us really understand exactly what to report at the SCAR level is just a lot of work, and a lot of places to go to, a lot of people to get information from. So it's easy to get lost, it's easy to underestimate the contribution of people. So he's just absolutely right. It's something early, capture everything you got, and just knock on people's door multiple times to get what you need from them, basically.
Thank you. Laura?
Yes, another advice for me is that I would suggest to organize a school for teaching. So then there would be a nice occasion for senior scientists and junior to meet and discuss, and even if it's not a school, but at least dedicate some time just to transfer knowledge and get some fresh ideas from the young scientists. That would be also one of the engine of the new program as well, like it was for PAIS.
Thank you. Anyone else want to make a comment? Tom?
2 words, communication and planning, I would say.
Thanks. Thank you. That was very brief and to the point. Anyone else would like to make a comment? Okay, so I'm going to say I'm sorry to those of you whose questions we didn't get to, but the answers will be posted. So please come back and take a look at that. I would like to thank all the presenters for talking about the SRPs and giving us such great overviews of the work that's been done. And thanks to everyone in the audience for coming in to listen. We really appreciate that. I want to remind you that you can use the Meeting Hub to connect with each other and also continue networking for SCAR 2020 online. And just a plug for the next session, which is a SCAR Capacity Building Workshop. And that's going to be Friday at 4 a.m. UTC. And if you're like me, it will be easier to know that that's in 5 hours from now. So thank you again for attending this session, and I hope you all stay healthy.